I finally got to interview my first survivor about a month or so ago with Senator Menendez and Corker, but won after all these years and months. But if I could, I want to thank the Intelligence Committee for doing a lot of hard work, but let's don't lose sight that this is just not about the State Department. My focus is going to be comprehensive, and Senator McCain has called for a joint select committee along with myself and Senator Ayotte for over a year now. Why? You don't want to stovepipe this thing. The Intelligence Committee tells us in pretty good detail about the failures of the State Department. But here's my question. In the 14 September White House meeting, where the Intelligence Committee prepared talking points for the White House that clearly established this was a terrorist attack with al-Qaeda people involved, who changed those talking points in that White House meeting? And I've got an email, I hope will come here in a moment, from General Petraeus. Basically, somebody in that meeting or before the meeting is inquiring of General Petraeus. The White House wants to take references to al-Qaeda out and basically sanitize the talking points. And he's upset, but he says, well, go ahead and do what they want. Nobody admires General Petraeus more than I do, but quite frankly, somebody needs to revisit that. And where was the intelligence community for 2 weeks when the President of the United States, not Susan Rice, was telling the entire world, we think this was a protest caused by video, when the intelligence community knew differently? So to my friends in the intelligence community, you need to answer that question. What input did you give? Did anybody pick up the phone and call somebody at the White House? You need to tell the President, quit doing that because it's not accurate. And another question. On the 15th, the 16th, and the 17th of September, all the survivors were interviewed by the FBI in Germany. I've talked to one. I can tell you in a quick summary, the man was brave. The people on the ground in the State Department deserve medals for going through what they did. But let me tell you this. He said there was no protest. There's not one report coming from Benghazi about a protest around the embassy. The Turkish ambassador left not too long before the attack. Do you think he had walked out in the middle of a protest? Do you think the ambassador would have went to bed if there had been a protest? The people in charge of security never reported a protest because there was not one. And he said there wasn't one. He said, I saw on my screen, and he's in charge of security at the time, 16 to 20 heavily armed people running through the gate, carrying a banner in Arabic. At the time, I didn't know what it said. But let me tell you what the banner was. It was the banner of Ansar al-Sharia, the al-Qaeda affiliate. And to my friends at New York Times, journalism has died at this paper. Do you really believe this wasn't a pre-planned terrorist attack with al-Qaeda affiliates in charge? The gentleman said there were 4 gun trucks around the compound. It was a coordinated military attack, and they were lucky to have survived. Who started this? Who planned this? The man's name is Cuomo, is that his name? The former Gitmo detainee? I can't say his last name, but I think it's Kumi. Yeah. The man who started Ansar al-Sharia came from Gitmo, a former Gitmo detainee, a Libyan, who went back to Libya, started this group. The 60 Minutes report identified him and a Mr. Katala as the organizers of this attack. All I can tell you is that there is no mystery about who planned this. It was an al-Qaeda affiliate in Libya. And 16 August, a cable is sent back from Chris Stevens to Washington at the State Department saying we can't defend the consulate because al-Qaeda, 10 training camps of al-Qaeda exist in Benghazi. The al-Qaeda flag is flying. And oh, by the way, the Red Cross had left Benghazi. The British had left Benghazi because of attacks by terrorist groups. This was long before September the 11th. So don't tell me we don't know. We do know. It was terrorist. It was a former Gitmo detainee who was bin Laden's bodyguard. What do you have to do, have a card? The guy that was in Gitmo that we let go was core al-Qaeda. He was bin Laden's bodyguard. They caught him in Pakistan. Fought in Afghanistan. Now, what we don't know in this report, Who in the White House changed the talking points? You want to know what Chris Christie did? Fine. Absolutely fair game. We know what he did when he found out what his people did about the traffic jam. He fired them. And he got up in front of the whole world and said, I'm embarrassed. It's my fault. I'm going to fire the people who did this bad thing. Name one person that has been held accountable for this bad thing called Benghazi. Name one person at the State Department who's been fired for ignoring repeated requests for additional security on the consulate coming from people in Libya. And oh, by the way, the Accountability Review Board, what did I learn in my interview with the survivor? I found out for the first time that Villa B and C, the places that were attacked in Benghazi, the State Department consulate, the lease had been renewed in July for an entire year. I didn't know that. For hundreds of thousands of dollars, well over $500,000. So you're going to tell me that they were going to close the consulate in December? That was the conclusion of the Accountability Review Board? That's not accurate. I tell you what I think they were going to do. I think Hillary Clinton was going to go down in December and announce the permanent facility would be opened in Benghazi. And to her credit, and Susan Rice's credit, these are the two women that pushed the president to keep Benghazi from being overrun during the war with Gaddafi. They got involved, and to their credit, they pushed the president to get involved militarily to prevent the slaughter of everybody in Benghazi. And I've been told that the plan for Benghazi was to have a permanent footprint, and for Secretary Clinton to go down there as one of her last acts to say, we're here and we're here to stay. The problem with that scenario is the security had deteriorated because we had absolutely no plan to follow on after the fall of Gaddafi. So I would just quickly wrap up.
Could I just ask one other question? I think a lot of people who are observers really have to view this and these actions on the part of the administration. A statement by now National Security Advisor Susan Rice on every talk show, Sunday talk show, that this was a result of a hateful video, a spontaneous demonstration. Al-Qaeda has been decimated, that you can only view that and some of these actions in the context of the fact that it was a political campaign, a presidential campaign going on, where the rhetoric, time after time, at rally after rally, the President of the United States and his surrogates said, bin Laden's dead, Al-Qaeda's on the run, the tide of war is receding. All of these events that took place at the consulate in Benghazi in the death of Christopher Stevens contradicted that storyline. And still, you cannot understand why 2 weeks later, before the United Nations, the President of the United States was still talking about spontaneous demonstration and hateful video. You can only understand that, in my view, that it was in the context of a storyline that was propagated throughout the 2012 presidential campaign.
And I think the White House, in my view, this is a reasonable conclusion, but not a fair conclusion because we don't know exactly what happened yet. But I can tell you this, somebody at the White House on 14 September pressured the intelligence community to change the story of Benghazi. And on the 15th of September, why did they pick Susan Rice? She says Secretary Clinton was tired and went through a lot of trauma. I'm sure that's true, but I know Secretary Clinton pretty well. I think she's tough. Let's put it this way. She couldn't be on TV to talk about what happened in the State Department because she was distraught. I don't buy that. Does anybody believe that about Secretary Clinton? And if it's true, it's something the American people need to consider. I don't believe it's true. I don't believe she was incapable of going on television, as Susan Rice says. I believe they picked the person very loyal to the president who would say whatever that needed to be said. And what she said was so far away from the truth, it needs to be investigated And what she said was so beneficial to the president's reelection, it needs to be investigated. She was speaking definitively about Benghazi on 15 September while the FBI was interviewing survivors on the 15th, the 16th, and the 17th. Why would any administration go on national television and tell the world what happened in Benghazi while the FBI is still interviewing people who were in the attack? And where did the FBI's interviews go? I talked to the deputy director of the FBI, who's now retired. He said not one person interviewed by the FBI in Germany ever said there was a protest. All of them said it was a terrorist attack. So how could the FBI have interviews from every person on the ground in Benghazi who worked for the State Department saying there was no protest, it was a terrorist attack, and that not get into the system? Did the FBI just sit on those interviews? Who did they give those interviews to? And how could Susan Rice tell the American people and the world, we know what happened in Benghazi before the interviews were over? She went on television to spin this story. How could the President of the United States, after the interviews were taken, go before the American people time and time again for weeks and tell a story about a protest that never occurred? Ladies and gentlemen, this may not be a big deal to you, but it's a hell of a big deal to me. And when Abu Ghraib blew up, Senator McCain and myself said, this is not a few rotten apples, this is system failure. And when before the surge, when Iraq was falling apart, we said, this is not working, no matter what people in the Bush administration are telling you. We know better, we've been there. And when Gitmo was a mess, we didn't sweep it under the rug. We worked with Senator Levin and Senator Feinstein, two great Americans, to get the definitive truth as we could, the best we could, about failures at Abu Ghraib, about Gitmo, and we spoke truth to power when it came to Iraq.
And the failures in Iraq, and we called for the resignation of the Secretary of Defense because of the failures in Iraq.
Yes, you did. Now, here we are, years later. The families have no clue as to what happened to their loved ones, and quit blaming the dead guy. This suggestion that Chris Stevens had fault for his own death. Chris Stevens was in Benghazi because that's where he was supposed to be, doing what America wanted him to do, try to hold Libya together. So there's not going to be any blaming the dead guy. Now, I would like to ask the question of Senator Ayotte. You have followed this as well as anybody. Can you tell us, from your point of view, the unanswered questions and whether or not you think there's evidence that this was a pre-planned terrorist attack versus a protest?
I want to thank my colleagues, the senator from South Carolina and the senator from Arizona, who have been relentless in finding the truth about what happened in Benghazi, where our ambassador and 3 brave Americans were murdered. There are so many questions. I would start with the accountability question that the senator from South Carolina raised. No one's been held accountable. Who's been held accountable for the failures? And if you look at this intel report, it's very clear that the intelligence community, according to this report, provided ample strategic warning that our people in Benghazi were at risk. There were failures, and no one has been held accountable. Why? I would like to know, as I look at these talking points, the question that was raised, why was the reference to al-Qaeda removed from the talking points? Who did that in the context of a presidential campaign? But also, take a look at these talking points. There is no reference in these talking points to a video. Look at the actual language of the talking points. So why is it that the spokesman for the president on January 13th is out there saying that the protests we're seeing, or that this is a reaction to this movie? Why is it that Susan Rice, the ambassador, is on television on multiple shows blaming the video? Not only was it absolutely wrong when she said al-Qaeda was decimated and it was misleading, particularly the fact that al-Qaeda had been removed from the talking points, but there's no reference in the talking points to a video. So who in the administration made up the video story? I think that's important for the American people to know, because it wasn't just Ambassador Susan Rice who relied on the video story. It was our President of the United States who talked about the video, and talked about it, frankly, after the ambassador went on all of the Sunday shows on September 16th. In fact, the president said as late as September 18th, when asked, basically he talked about the video and said, you had a video that was released by somebody who lives here, sort of a shadowy character, here's what happened, who had made an extremely offensive comment. So here we have the President of the United States as late as September 18th, and then again on September 20th, you have the President saying on Univision Network, responding to the possible involvement of al-Qaeda. He's asked, is al-Qaeda involved? Here's what we do know, that the natural protests that arose because of the outrage over the video were used as an excuse by extremists to see if they could harm U.S. interests. Well, where did the video come from? Even what the intel community came up with, which was deficient and which clearly was subject to political influence because it removed the reference to al-Qaeda, has no reference to a video. So I think there's a lot of questions that need to be answered, but here's the most important question. Why has no one been brought to justice? The president stood on, I believe it was September 12th, and said, we will find out who did this. We will bring them to justice. To those families, those victims, no one has been brought to justice. And in fact, you have people like Abu Khatala, who is a former commander of Ansar al-Sharia, who's believed to be there that night, sitting in cafes in Libya, giving press interviews, and yet we have, and there's much to believe that he is likely to be involved in this, and many other terrorists. No one's been brought to justice. So why is that? How come no one has the curiosity not only to answer the questions of what happened that night, but also to ensure that justice
With
is
the
done?
Senator Yu, I'm trying to find the press statement on September the 10th from a White House official that says, the president has consulted with his national security team, I'm paraphrasing, about the threats we face throughout the world, and we are ready. This is on September the 10th. What does this report tell us about September the 11th? We were so far away from being ready that it is unnerving. So there's a lot to be asked. Why would somebody in the White House issue a statement on 10 September talking about being ready for any contingency anywhere and basically assuring the American people the president's on top of this when clearly he was not?
Another question I made to my colleague is the attack went on for a period of some 9 hours, as I recall. And over that period of time, with the hundreds of aircraft that we have, and ships and other military capabilities that we have in the area, in the Mediterranean, we were not able to get any real significant help. Now, there's a number of things where a team supposedly landed, were held at the airport, were not allowed to move in, all of that. All of these are questions that have not been answered. General Ham told you and I over the phone that he didn't have any assets that were capable of reaching Benghazi. You mean we don't have a capability over an 8 or 9 hour period to get some relief to an ongoing attack? And again, what was the hang-up that kept people at the airport that finally did get there?
If I could follow along with that thought, it's a very good question. Number one, if the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs publicly testified they knew it was a terrorist attack from the moment it started and told the White House, how did that get lost? How can you start talking about a protest in a video when your own Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs in real time tell the White House, but they only spoke to the President once with a pre-scheduled meeting just when the attack started? The Secretary of Defense said,
we still don't know what the president did that evening?
Well, we know after he's answered one question, he said he wanted to be transparent and open and let everybody read the story of Benghazi. We've destroyed a small forest asking questions, and he answered one question finally. Did you call anybody in Libya, Mr. President, that night? No. You got a rescue team held up at the Benghazi airport for 2.5 hours.
Well, may I also add, too, that, the president, we heard testimony that obviously the Secretary of Defense, others knew right away this was a terrorist attack. And let's not forget the 60 Minutes interview where he's asked about that on September 12th. And he says it's too early to tell exactly how this came about. When he's asked directly, is this a terrorist attack, he would not identify it as a terrorist attack. And I will also add this. What's so sad about this is no one's been held accountable. The warnings were there. Not only were the warnings there from the August 16th cable that came from the embassy, from Ambassador Stevens, saying that the consulate could not withstand a coordinated attack, but what's been lost in all this, when we talk about the New York Times trying to erase al-Qaeda from this, well, the day before that, Ayman al-Zawahiri, the head of al-Qaeda, released a video just before September 11th of 2012. Just before this terrorist attack, which, by the way, occurred on September 11th, of course, which should have given us a pretty direct clue that this was a terrorist attack, but Ayman al-Zawahiri issued this video acknowledging and eulogizing the death of Abu Yahya al-Libi in a drone strike and calling for terrorist attacks. Al-Libi was a Libyan who served as the second in command in al-Qaeda under Zawahiri and was a top leader in the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group. Think about it. The evidence that was there before, not only what we didn't do to protect that consulate, but the warnings that a terrorist attack was coming.
If I may, who was the person who decided to approve a year's lease on this piece of property in July after it had been attacked in June? They blew a hole in the wall that 40 people could go through on June 10th. So somebody said, hey, this is a great site. Let's extend the lease for another year to July 2013, and never reinforced it. Never added any appreciable security, denied all the security requests. This goes on and on. If you want to know about the bridge, great. If you want to know what Chris Christie knew when and what he should have known, great, go for it. All fair. Does anybody care about what our president did that night? Does anybody really care if the President of the United States for 2 weeks talks about a protest that never happened and just all the evidence suggests otherwise? Does anybody really care that the consulate was a death trap and nobody in Washington ever responded? Does anybody care that nobody has been brought to justice? Does anybody in this country care that somebody in the White House on the 14th of September, obviously for political reasons, took the intelligence and turned it upside down? Does anybody care that Susan Rice, who has nothing to do with Benghazi, was the spokesman for the country, telling a story not founded in fact, founded in political advantage? Well, I think Americans do care.
Well, let me ask the senator from South Carolina, does anyone care that the Secretary of State claimed that she knew nothing about this August 16th cable? Didn't know about these cables leading up to the fact that what had happened in Benghazi, the warning, the Red Cross left, the French left, the blown hole through the consulate, the August 16th cable. Yet Secretary Panetta was aware of it. Chairman Dempsey was aware of it when he came before the Armed Services Committee. But the Secretary of State
how can the Secretary of Defense know about the security environment in a Benghazi consulate and the Secretary of State not? All I can say, it does matter.